This video is for English Literature Paper 2, Section B, Power and Conflict Poetry. And in this video we'll be looking at War Photographer. Remember, you need a copy of the poem and you need a pen to make notes. And it's really important that you read the poem through a couple of times first, although I will cover what's going on in each verse of the poem. So firstly, let's look at the poem as a whole and a little bit to do with context. Carol Ann Duffy is a modern poet. She's still alive. And she's friends with two war photographers. So maybe she was interested in their perspective and the challenges they face as a war photographer. And she's giving a voice to the people behind the pictures that we see in the newspaper and on TV and things like that. So it's really important to think about the perspective in this poem. It also references a very specific war photograph in relation to the Vietnam War. Let's have a look at the first verse then. In this verse, the war photographer has returned from war. He's in his darkroom developing his pictures. Now, obviously nowadays we would do all of this digitally. But previously, this poem was written in 1985, so quite a long time ago. And previously, those pictures would have been taken on a film camera that would have had film in, and the pictures would have been developed in a dark room. We're really going to focus on the highlighted bits only. Remember, we've got a huge task in trying to understand these 15 poems, so it's important that we really pinpoint and learn the quotations that give us plenty of rich language to analyse. You don't need to write down the summary of each verse if it's clear for you what is going on in each verse. So let's look at that first phrase, finally alone. The first emotion that we get here is a sense of relief through this adverb finally. It's almost like the war photographer has been desperate to escape where he was, and it hints at the trauma and suffering of the job. Emotions are really key in this poem. The next phrase that's interesting is spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Now, if you've ever looked at a film camera, you get a kind of reel or a roll of different images that the pictures would be taken on. So the literal meaning here is the camera film on a reel is the spool, and the suffering is the images of suffering that he's captured. But there's a metaphorical meaning here to this phrase, spools of suffering. A spool is a reel, so you can get lots on a reel and you can unravel it. It's all rolled up, so you can unroll it. And this idea here is quite hyperbolic. It's exaggerating the suffering. As he unravels the images, he's unraveling maybe his own suffering, but he's also kind of revealing all these different experiences of the victims of war. It could also mean that he is kind of unraveling, and there's a lot here about him maybe trying to control his own emotions. So this phrase, spools of suffering, is also sibilance. And we want to give layers of alternative interpretation. So if we can say it could mean this, or perhaps it means this, but also maybe it means this. So on that third bullet point, I've covered what two of those could be. Maybe this sibilance is creating a kind of evil hissing sound, a sinister tone that reflects the evil nature of war. But also this shh sound, spools of suffering, could relate to a kind of shushing sound. And this relates to one of the other key ideas in the poem, this kind of idea of ignorance. You know, maybe we're shushing him as if we don't really want to know, we don't really want to see, we don't really want this kind of suffering that happens elsewhere in the world to impact on our daily lives. And then the second part of this line 2, is ordered rows. So here the ordered rows of this spools of suffering are, as he unravels the pictures, the rows of photos. So that is our literal meaning that I've put in bullet point 4. But again, this phrase has a metaphorical, a deeper meaning. The ordered rows very much contrasts with the chaos of the spools of suffering. And the metaphorical meaning here, maybe he's trying to make sense of, or he's trying to organize or categorize the experiences that people have and their feelings. And also maybe control his own emotions at this point. Here, the reader is reminded that war is messy and it has devastating and widespread impact. It could even remind us of the kind of rows of graves that you see from mass genocide associated with war. Then in lines 3 and 4 it says, "The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass." Firstly, we've got the colour imagery of red. Now, in a dark room, you've got to have some light to be able to see what you're doing, but any light is going to damage the photos. So dark rooms would have a red light that wouldn't damage the photos, but would allow the photographer to see what he is doing. And again, this colour could be significant. Maybe it makes us think of blood or suffering, but again, we sometimes associate red with anger. Maybe this could be Atna at what he has witnessed. And then we move on to the simile, as though this were a church and he a priest. There's a real sense of respect here. Maybe the people that he's taken pictures of haven't had a proper burial, and it's quite highly likely, in fact, that that's the case. And we would often think of priests and churches in relation to death as well, funerals and what have you. So maybe, again, it's this idea of him trying to bring order to people's suffering, and it sets a very sombre tone. Sombre means serious, but also slightly depressing. In the last line, we've got a list of places: Belfast in Ireland, Beirut, Phnom Penh, and then the next sentence, all flesh is grass. When you get full stops in the middle of the line here, it's called a caesura, and it breaks up the line. And this could reflect the effect that war has, breaking up lives, breaking up families, breaking up communities. But the other thing here is the different places that he's chosen also linked to the kind of universality of war. It happens everywhere. Nowhere is immune to the suffering of war. So we've got places closer to home, such as Ireland, but also from continents across the globe. The places that he's chosen, or that Duffy has chosen, all start with either a B or a P. And these sounds, the B and the P, are plosive. They kind of explode in your mouth. They're very harsh sounds. And maybe this plosive alliteration could echo the bullets or the bombs dropping that we might associate with war. So the sound effects of war. We've got almost some auditory imagery here. Maybe these sounds are replaying in his mind, sort of almost having flashbacks. And there's a lot in this poem to do with memories. As he kind of develops the pictures, he remembers what he has seen. But either way, these sounds are harsh and explosive and remind us of the harsh realities of war. Finally, we've got this short sentence, all flesh is grass. And this is a biblical phrase. It really means that life is fleeting. You know, all flesh, human body, returns to grass, returns to the earth. So it means really that when we die, we return back to the soil, we return back to nature. And this could be seen as quite a pessimistic or negative view of life, that we're all destined to die. But I guess the question here for the reader is, you know, should anyone have to die in such a violent way, you know, in this sort of associated with war? So there's lots just in this first verse that we might want to look at. Pause the video here. Make sure you've used the notes to annotate your copy of the text. Verse 2, I've deliberately not picked out so many quotations, and if you really think that actually there's lots that you've got in verse 1 and that seems like enough for you, you might want to leave verse 2 and verse 3 and just focus on verses 1 and verse 4. But either way, let's make sure that we understand what's going on here in verse 2 of the poem. So at this point then, the war photographer starts to prepare the chemicals that he's going to use to develop his pictures, and he starts to reflect on how he's feeling. Here he's really starting to notice the differences between home, rural England that's mentioned here, and the places, the war zones that he's been in. And here, if we're thinking about this poem as part of a cluster in terms of power and conflict, we really start to see the internal conflict that the war photographer is feeling here, because he cannot reconcile what he has experienced elsewhere with what's going on at home. And we can see this in the vocabulary that Duffy has chosen. So we've got two semantic fields here. We've got words that are very much to do with ordinariness, like ordinary and simple, weather. But you've also got words like tremble, explode, nightmare, which suggest fear and violence. The fact that the war photographer says that his hands are trembling, even though they didn't before, could have connotations of the fear or anger that he's feeling, or again could be a suggestion of trauma. Maybe he's literally shaking with the emotion that he feels. And we can compare this with the phrase ordered rose in verse 1, where he was trying to control himself, but maybe he can't. And in this way we can compare it to a lot of the other poems that look at the effect of war on soldiers, but here we're seeing the effect of war on the war photographer. But the effect very much here is this idea that he cannot reconcile, he cannot bring together the two different places that he's experienced. And maybe now that he's back in England, things just don't feel right. In terms of developing that effect, then maybe for the reader, our response is it reminds us of how lucky we are to live somewhere safe. And it reminds us that our worries are very much straightforward compared to the experiences of individuals in a war zone. And the emotion here is very much one of anger. The war photographer is really asking himself, how can we worry about simple things like the weather? Dispel means to be able to get rid of. So, if it's a sunny day, we can get rid of a bad feeling. But other people in the world are experiencing much deeper problems than us. This is where we also get the reference to the famous photo. So where it says, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Fields exploding relates to landmines, which was a huge problem in Cambodia as well as other countries. And behind that you can see the image of a girl called Kim Phuc. She did survive, but this was a famous war photo that was taken during the Vietnam War that really led to a lot of protests and eventually the end of the Vietnam War. She had a napalm bomb, a chemical bomb dropped on her village, and it literally burnt the whole village down. She's naked because it has literally burnt the clothes off her body. And lots of people were really badly scarred. It literally burned the skin off their bones. So this was a really distressing and horrific image. And at the time that this poem was written in 1985, the public would have been, very familiar with that image. Pause the video here and make any notes that you need to for verse 2. But remember, if you feel that you've got enough from verse 1, and this is too much for you, the verse 1 would give you plenty. As we move on to verse 3, the picture starts to develop, and the war photographer, as the picture starts to develop on the negative, he starts to remember when he took the picture. So it says, a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. And this is where the picture's starting to become clear. But again, Duffy's choice of words here is really important. As the image develops, it seems to twist. This verb here has connotations of pain, and if we think of something being twisted, we think of it being warped. And maybe he's saying, the fact that war even happens is twisted. Why would we inflict so much pain on fellow human beings? So this idea of cruelty and bitterness really key here. The image that developed is a ghost. The noun ghost could suggest this sense of insignificance. Now, obviously, it could also tell us that the image that he's taken is of someone who's died, but it could also mean that it's easy for us to forget about this person. They're not really significant because it's happening elsewhere, and links to the phrase foreign dust at the end of this verse is happening somewhere else, far away from us, and therefore we don't really have to pay attention to it. Again, we've got words like cries that suggest suffering, but then also the fact that he seeks approval from the man's wife to take this picture. He probably wouldn't be able to speak the same language as the people, as the country he's in, so he does that without words. And again, this links to the idea of him as a priest, or some kind of priest. He's being respectful to these people as they die. And the fact that he feels that he's doing what someone must. The word must here has a sense of duty, that he really feels a sense of obligation to carry on with this line of work despite how distressing it is. So again, there's only a few key points here, few key words, but even if you just remember one quotation, words like twist or ghost, like a one-word quotation, is plenty. So you might find that some of those individual words are easier for you to remember than the longer quotations. Verse 4 is another key verse, and this is why you might want to just leave verse 2 and 3 and think, actually, I'm really going to focus on the quotations in verse 4. So now that the pictures have been developed, the war photographer's got hundreds of pictures. That's why he says 100 agonies. He's going to take them to the magazine or newspaper editor, and they're going to select the best ones. Again, even this idea that they're going to look at someone's suffering and think, well, which are the best ones? Really sort of shows that we're quite removed from the experiences, the real experiences that these people have. And what the war photographer starts to realise is that the people who are reading the newspaper will glance at it and they'll feel sad for a very small amount of time, but then their lives will carry on and nothing will really change for them. And then by the end, he's back in an aeroplane, and what we can infer here is he's going back to a war zone. And this gives a real cyclical feel to the end of the poem. Let's look at some of the key phrases here then. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between bath and pre-lunch beers. Now there's a sense of irony here when it says the reader. It's talking about the reader of the Sunday Supplement, the magazine that you get in your newspaper. But we are also in the position of the reader. So whilst it's criticising, and Duffy is criticising the role of the reader of the newspaper because they don't care, actually it could relate to us as well, because we are also readers of this poem. So we need to be very aware of our own reaction at this point. That's really what Duffy is trying to highlight. So how does the reader react? The reader's eyeballs prick. And the line deliberately stops here, even though the meaning carries on into the next line. So the full stop doesn't come until beers. And this is what is enjambement, where the sentence runs on into the second line. And this is deliberate here because it really emphasises the phrase eyeballs prick. And this sounds torturous, it sounds painful, and it creates a sense of violence and suffering. But ultimately this is contrasted with the phrase on the next line with tears, which is a bit of an anticlimax. We're not experiencing real pain like the victims of war. And the tears that we feel here, they're disingenuous. And disingenuous really means insincere, they're not honest. Prick is just a tiny moment, just a short pain. Like a tiny drop of blood if you prick your finger. So we feel, or we have such a small tear, and then we just move on. So we're not really affected by what is going on elsewhere. And we carry on with our lives. And the phrase that Duffy has chosen here to show that we carry on with our lives is between bath and pre-lunch beers. And we've got two things very much associated with pleasure here, having a bath and having a beer. And again, suggesting this idea that our lives just carry on, and we carry on doing the things that are pleasurable to us. We're not really affected by what we see. And again, we've got this plosive alliteration in bath and beers that reminds us of the plosive alliteration in verse 1. And the plosive sounds here are connoting anger. It's almost like you can imagine Duffy, or the war photographer himself, his voice almost like spitting the words out in anger, when he's recalling this to maybe somebody, that he's disgusted at the fact that we don't appreciate the suffering of other people, even though we're staring at it, through his eyes, through the photos that are in the magazine or the newspaper. And then it moves from a focus on the reader back to the war photographer. And from his aeroplane, or from aeroplane, he stares impassively. The word impassively here means, the adverb means blankly, and it could suggest that maybe he's stopped caring, he's become numb to emotion. And this very much reminds us of the soldiers in Exposure, but also the soldier in Bayonet Charge, where his rifle is numb as a smashed arm. So maybe this is a strategy to deliberately protect himself from what he's seeing. And then finally, the last phrase, they do not care. And again, it's shifted back to a focus on the reader here. So we've got that one little phrase that focuses on the war photographer and then back to the reader. And the pronoun they is really accusing here, and contrasts with him. He as an individual, he's a lonely and isolated figure. And the irony here is we're actually sympathising with the war photographer and thinking, oh, how bad is it for him? Isn't that sad that he's got to go back out and take all these horrible pictures? But that's a bit ironic, really, because really who he wants us to sympathise with are the true victims of war, and the people in the photos. So possibly at the end of the poem there could be a sense of guilt in the reader, and that's not just the readers of the newspaper, that's us, the readers of the poem, because we're not really appreciating the impact of war, and our sympathies are with the wrong person. Pause the video here then before we look at some of the kind of key ideas overall to make sure you've got all those notes. Let's look at the structure of the poem then. Firstly, it's important to notice that this poem is written in the third person, and there's a sense of detachment here, both from the war photographer and he tries to detach himself from what he witnesses almost as a safety mechanism, but also as a criticism of the people that he's trying to communicate to, that he feels that society, and maybe Duffy herself feels that society is detached from these wars that happen in different countries. One of the other things that's really clear and strong in this poem here are the rhyming couplets. So the second and third and the fifth and sixth lines in each verse rhyme. So we've got these rhyming couplets. And this rigid structure, especially with 6 lines in each verse, contrasts the chaos of war and war zones. The fact that the structure stays the same and it doesn't change all the way through relates to this idea of powerlessness. Remember, we're writing about these poems in relation to power and conflict. And the war photographer, despite going out to all these different war zones and taking these pictures, doesn't really seem to have any impact. Another key feature of the structure is the cyclical or circular nature of the poem. At the beginning, he is returning from a war zone and he is relieved that he's finally alone. At the end, he's going back out to a war zone, possibly the same one, possibly to another one. And this reminds the reader of the futility and the relentlessness of war. The war photographer is not able to bring about any change or any end to the violence and suffering that he witnesses. And this creates a very pessimistic, very negative feel to the poem, because he has no control. Let's look at the writer's ideas then. Maybe Duffy is trying to expose our lack of sympathy for others' problems and suffering, particularly those in other countries that feel far away. She's highlighting the violence and suffering of war on others, not just on soldiers, but the victims of war, and also the suffering of the photographer himself. And in this sense, we can write about this poem to do with identity or the focus on an individual. You might even want to look at it in comparison to a poem like Checking Out My History. She's also trying to reveal this kind of idea of the futility. Remember, that means the pointlessness and the relentlessness of war. There always seems to be a war somewhere that needs to be documented. And when will governments and society learn or change or stop so that we haven't got this endless cycle of war? The other main idea here is this idea of the poem being very defeatist and pessimistic. The war photographer doesn't seem to have any impact despite these really dramatic, arresting images that he takes, nothing really seems to change. And then finally, let's think about themes and links. Powerlessness, if we're thinking about the idea of power and conflict, powerlessness is really key here. And the war photographer is not able to make any changes or have any lasting impact. Obviously, it's dealing with conflict in terms of a war zone, but also the war photographer feels a conflict within himself. So we have this internal conflict. He's not having the desired impact, and he's struggling to reconcile life back home with what he's witnessed out in the war zone. We might also want to write about the effect of war on others. We might want to write about the different emotions in this poem in relation to other poems, and the idea of the war photographer as an individual in comparison to individuals in other poems as well. I've only put 2 here in terms of links, Charge of the Light Brigade and Bayonet Charge, but any poem that's out about an individual would link with this poem, and any of the war poems would link with this poem. So actually you can link it with loads and loads of poems. So as with previous poems, here are your prompts and your quotations. So this is a good slide to focus on when you've made your notes on the poem to see what you can remember. I would focus on either the prompts or the quotations to start with. So use the 10 prompts to help you write down everything that you can remember about the poem. Alternatively, use the quotations and think about what would you say about them. I've picked out 4 in bold that I think are the most important ones to learn. If you can remember some of the other key words, that's fantastic. But if you knew these 4 quotations about war photographer, they would give you lots to say. Finally, just a reminder of the different activities that you can do once you have studied the poem. So once you've made your notes, once you've used the prompts, once you've used the quotations, there's a list of the different revision tasks that you can do there. It is not just enough to make notes on the poem. You need to go back and practice retrieving all that information. Hope this has been helpful, and there's plenty more videos for all of the other poems.